is just tracking in rotos. We tracked his hands, and we were able to track in rotos and clone those rotos so that they could be applied to all the lights, so, or at least all the lights we needed to cut those out of. So that ends up giving us a pretty nice shadow once we get that in there. It gives us a fairly good representation of the shadow. We're cutting out those fingers out of the lights we want to cut them out and not cutting them out of others, rather than doing a color correct on the whole thing. That ended up working pretty well. One thing, if I show you the beauty render again, we had done a lot of look dev work on it. One thing we noticed when we were looking at the actual fabric mask that Jackie was wearing was that it had all these little fibers coming off it, like it had been washed a lot of times. So you got a lot of, if I show you the plate, you've got a lot of these little hairs coming off, and it really helps to sell the shot. So we put those into the shot, into the shader. The problem was when we rendered out the individual lights from Houdini, they tended to not show up in the individual light renders. So you can see here we've got a few little hairs, but compared to the beauty render, not nearly so many. So when we go to multiply these lights against the constant pass to recreate what Houdini is doing, it ends up cutting out all those hairs. Because regardless of the fact you've got them in the alpha, it's not in the color, and so the color multiplication is just, it's cutting it right out. So we could have spent more time trying to figure out how to get Houdini to do it, but we decided a really cheap, quick fix would be to take those renders, and we'll take our combined lighting and blur it out, right? So which takes all the light that we had, and the light and the color, and takes it out past the edge of the face. And then we merged our proper lighting back over top of it, so that when we finally go and multiply that over top of the constant pass, lo and behold, we've got all of our hairs again. So it's a cheap fix, and it's down and dirty, but it works, and it saves a lot of time. So now I can get back into, I'm going to get back into the ink blot here. I'll take you back up, show you the ink blot that we rendered out of Houdini. And you can see here we've got our pink and blue loveliness. What we did was we then went and separate that out into our secondary pass that I talked about before and our primary pass. And we combined those two together. Now, the beauty of having them separate like that is that we could dial them in and out as we wanted. So from scene to scene, from shot to shot, the lighting was slightly different, and because the lighting on his face was different, how the ink blot would react would be different. We'd need to dial it darker or lighter. And so we could just color correct each individual pass. So in this case, the primary ink blot pass, we lighten that up without affecting the secondary pass, and vice versa. We could do the same thing. So we would then multiply that against our constant pass, and then multiply our lights on top of that, and you can see how it reacts here. Now in this scene I actually had to go and do some further roto on it because this light was so bright. We had to affect this side of the ink blot separately to this one, and it turned out pretty well. We really, for the most part, got really good reaction from the ink blot to the lights to the fabric, and we were able to convincingly create this fabric on the plate. Another thing we needed to do, we were really keen on maintaining the depth of field in the shot, because there was a lot of shallow depth of field where you'd get a full frame shot of Rorschach's face, and this part of his face is in focus, and it very quickly goes out of focus to the side of his head. Now, we didn't want to just use a Z blur, because that never looks as good as a true defocus, and the Z depth passes we rendered, those don't always work well with a defocus as a mask, because you get sharp edges and stuff. What we decided to do, kind of a slightly novel approach, we did end up using the Z-Blur tool, but not to actually blur the image. Z-Blur has this thing called focal plane setup, and what that does is it allows you to see the areas that you want to be in focus. Normally, green is in focus, red is near defocus, blue is far defocus. But we decided we didn't care about the green being in focus. We wanted to use either the red or the blue as a matte to apply a defocus. So it's a nice soft gradient mask that we could dial in using the Z-Blur tool. We would actually use this focal plane setup as an actual image for a mask. So in this case, because it was the front of his mask that was just ever so slightly out of focus, we wanted to use the red. Most of the time we used the blue because the front of his face was in focus. So after a little bit of wrangling on that, we end up with a fairly soft mask that's following his face. It kind of fades off nicely, and we can put whatever defocus we want on there. Another thing we wanted to do is, in most of the scenes, a lot of the scenes, Rorschach's scarf covers up his neck. And you can see here that we've rendered all the way down to the base of his neck, the base of the mask. In a lot of cases, we didn't want to use that because the mask on the stand-in mask that Jackie was wearing on set had a lot of nice deformations, a lot of nice wrinkles and shadows, and there were no tracking markers on the neck, so nothing we had to take care of there. We wanted to be able to get rid of the CG neck where we could, but we didn't want to have to roto that because, you know, tracking soft edge roto, keeping it in the exact same place on a CG render would be tricky. So what we ended up doing is we rendered a blend mask. It was just a mask we painted with a gradient that you can see fades off in through here. And we were able to take color corrects and dilate erodes. If I put this into there, we could color correct that and say we want more of the neck to show. You can see it goes more green there, or less of the neck to show. And if I go back to the RGB, once we pre-multiply it by that mask, we get a nice cutoff that blends fairly well. In some cases, you still have to roto a little bit in there, but it ends up cutting it off nicely, blending it into the neck that's already there. Then, of course, you combine that over the plate, and we've got it looking fairly good. And, of course, you still need to cut out all the stuff that goes in front of it. What we tended to do with this was we pre-worked most of the roto. We had a roto team, or any artist that had a shot that was finished and they were waiting for the next elements would go ahead and roto other shots for other artists. In this case, we didn't have the roto ahead of time. So what I ended up doing was, again, using tracking his hands, we would roto his hands. And there's a lot of motion blur in this scene. If you remember, as he was pulling the mask down, it's going down really fast. And we didn't want to have to take the time and try and feather out the masks to try and get that. But the nice thing with Nuke is that we're able to use its motion blur 2D and its vector blur. If I show you the roto, you can see it's a hard edge roto there. But using the vector blur, if I go back to a motion blurred frame, you could see we get a nice soft motion blur that matches with the scene. And so that saved us a lot of time in scenes where we had to do that. So, all in all, we end up with this scene where everything's very nicely blended, very nicely integrated, and you got a believable fabric, a believable ink blot, and the ink blot itself tells a story. It gives a performance. So, if we look at the final for this shot, we end up with a really nice looking shot that's fairly convincing. Everything reacts to the light the way it should. Everything reacts at depth of field the way it should. And then we do that 300 more times. So that's Rorschach in a nutshell.
Man, I love interviews like that. Seeing render passes and all that geeky stuff, all the stuff behind the scenes, things you don't usually get to see. It's really cool. And thank you very much, Greg, for showing us all of your work. Well, guys, that's all we have time for today. So until next time, see ya. For more industry news, in-depth features, podcasts and forums, check out fxguide.com. And for visual effects training, check out fxphd.com.